South Africa is set to host the Sherpas Finance and Central Bank Deputies meeting this week. It marks the first major engagement since the country assumed its year-long presidency of the Group of 20. The G20, a forum comprising of the world's largest economies such as China, India, France, Germany and the US, previously included South Africa as the sole African country. This has changed following the inclusion of the AU in 2023. And for more on this, let's now speak to Professor Patrick Bond. He is a sociology and political economist from the University of Johannesburg. Professor, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. And now, as South Africa gears up to hold this meeting with the Sherpa and, of course, as well as the Finance and Central Bank Deputies, what are your expectations from this meeting?
Well, I must be frank, they're very low. We've had the two big events 3 weeks ago, the Rio hosting of the G20, and I suspect that the main financial proposal, that is to tax the world's billionaires, will really be, dropped back to a lower priority we've seen in this country. The billionaires get their money out of the country, lots of illicit financial flows, we've had to be grey listed, and lower taxes. And then the other big event 2 weeks ago, the Azerbaijan, the COP29, the United Nations Conference of Parties to deal with the climate finance, only delivered a $300 billion commitment, but much less once we take into account inflation. Regrettably, South Africa departed from the African consensus because our environment minister, Dion George, has been, well, he's from Sandton, he says that's just fine. And I think South Africa doesn't accept the idea that there's climate debt owed by the debtor countries, including the BRICS countries, including South Africa. So my expectations for progress from a South African hosting are quite low, in fact.
And maybe let's talk about South Africa and its positioning in the G20. What is your take on South Africa's role during this presidency?
I must say last week was depressing. And the reason was because of the obsequious way that our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, handled the elephant in the room, Donald Trump, who intends to drop out of the climate negotiations and has already said he'll put on massive taxes if you try to change anything to do with the currencies, or if you're importing your goods into the United States in advantageous terms. Even the neighbors, Mexico and Canada, are going to get hit. But especially when he said if the BRICS are trying to have an alternative system to the US dollar, we desperately need one, given how abusive the US Federal Reserve has been with quantitative easing and then with raising interest rates. So Donald Trump is the sort of disaster, wrecking ball to arrive at the G20. In November, if he even bothers to come, he considers South Africa one of the S-hole countries, after all. And he's going to be inheriting the G20 for 2026. That hosting will be chaotic. So it was disappointing that President Ramaphosa opened the doors wide, said, let's have a game of golf, and we'll welcome Donald Trump. I mean, that's absolutely the wrong way to deal with a man like that. You need to stand up to a bully.
I know, of course, South Africa has a number of issues that it would also like to deal with. And coming to the importance of this meeting for South Africa, and the continued struggles it has, we have a stagnant economy, a very high unemployment rate. How should, South Africa deal with this meeting, particularly with the number of factors it faces as a country, with a very stagnant economy and a very high unemployment rate, even the unemployment of graduates?
I think, Mbali, many of those problems stem from exactly what one of the commentators said. We are tied into a world economy where we're exporting minerals, platinum metal group minerals, gold and iron ore and coal, especially coal to Israel, is to fuel the genocide. We're in all sorts of appalling relationships with the world economy. And regrettably, the G20 fuses the imperialist world powers with a sub-imperialist layer, that is the BRICS. And this is why I think the G20 has been so damaging, because it postures that it wants reform of multilateral institutions, reform of the world trade and financing system, but it just keeps taking the same system over. And now we have a junior partner relationship for President Ramaphosa, for Finance Minister Kamangwana, for Central Bank Governor Lesego Kganyago this week. It, to me, only reinforces the worst aspects that keep South Africa in a very, let's say, subaltern or subordinate position. And that means more unemployment, more poverty, as we just dig out the minerals and export the value relatively unprocessed, with basically the same structure as during apartheid economically, with the political, let's say, democracy, but economic oppression.
And while Professor, you paint a very bleak picture of what we can expect from, this week's meeting. At the same time, a number of African countries will be looking towards this meeting to see what it has in store for them, as particularly when, the African continent faces a number of issues. How can South Africa influence, this week's meeting for further African issues?
Well, because South Africa has a sub-imperial role in Africa, basically exploiting the continent with our corporates taking far more out than putting back, and facilitating lots of illegality through Santon especially, I would say the best thing we can learn from Africa is how you resist. So from Kenya in June, Nigeria in August, Mozambique as we speak, protest. The activists and civil society are really the only ones with the clarity to say that the whole system isn't working. And unfortunately, I suspect what will happen next November, big protests. Cyril Ramaphosa won't do what I saw in Rio Lula do, which is to go out to divide and conquer his left. I think we're going to see big protests. They'll probably put everyone 4 or 5 kilometers away, but the message will come through that the elites really aren't doing a very good job. And some of the reasons I've just said, like climate or inequality or failure to tax the ultra-rich, are going to be on display, unfortunately, in the Santon Convention Center. People won't like what they see.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your time and for that insight in terms of what we can expect this coming week. That is Professor Patrick Bond, sociology and political economist from the University of Johannesburg.